There are many ways to look at consolation and desolation in the spiritual exercises of St Ignatius, and we've talked about that quite a bit in this series. One of the simplest ways, and it's a way that helps me, and I wanted to share it with you because it can have a real impact on how you do the examen each day. One is very simply, consolation is something that draws us closer to God, a movement, a feeling, a thought that draws us closer to God, an event in our lives perhaps that leads us to God. And desolation is something that leads us away from God, or gives us a discouragement in the following of God. So consolation is something that leads us to God, and desolation, something that leads us away from God. But if we look at it even a little bit more deeply, a consolation is something that God is using or giving us to draw us closer to the very love God has for us. So consolation comes from God and is a way of moving us towards God. Meanwhile, desolation, we could probably say, is the opposite. The evil one, the bad spirit, is trying to thwart the purposes of God and providing us with things to draw us away from God instead of walking in the path of our Lord. So, when it comes to doing the examen, it can be very helpful as we review our day just to ask ourselves the simple question, how has God been drawing me to God? What has God been doing? Inspiring in me, giving me, showing me, that's drawing me more and more close to God. That's consolation, and that's a wonderful question to ask ourselves. And then we become more aware that our lives are in this communication constant, this communication beautiful between God and us. And so we're trying to respond to these consolation, these gifts, these movements, these encouragements to follow God. And similarly, we can ask ourselves in the examen, what has been drawing me away from God? What has been discouraging me? What has been encouraging me not to follow God? And in doing that, then we become aware that there is in me or around me or throughout the world something that moves me away from God, encourages me. And to see my spiritual life in terms of that, to see my daily life in terms of these contrary movements, can be really helpful, because with that clarity I can say, so how is God moving me to grow closer to God? And what's happening that's moving me away from God? And in doing that, the examen focuses our attention on really powerful movements within us. And as we embrace the ones that come from God, we find ourselves walking more closely with God. We find ourselves stronger in fighting the other temptations that come our way, that lead us away from God. Because God, for sure, is tempting us to be closer and closer to Him. God is tempting us. Let's give in to that temptation and turn away from the other. And that's the wisdom of St Ignatius for today.